How did your family end up living in South Africa?
My parents were born in the early 1920s, and they were descendants of the British immigrants from the 1820 settlers.
Tell me about growing up in South Africa during apartheid rule in the
When I
60s.
was very young, we lived in a small village, and the only black people that I knew were the black people who worked as domestic servants for my family. So typically, a husband and wife would live with you in your home in a small apartment or in a small suite that was part of the house. So that was my only contact with the black population of South Africa, and it was later that I learned that they were not free to move around unless they carried what was called their pass books, which identified them and said how old they were, where they were born, where they resided, and what sort of job they had. And they were only allowed to live in the white cities if they had employment and therefore had these registered passbooks that they had to carry around.
When did you first become aware of the apartheid?
I first became aware when I was probably about 10 years old, which was around the time I started using public transportation. And I became aware that the buses, if you were waiting for a bus to come, you had to watch the sign above the windscreen because it would say whites or blacks. And if the sign said blacks, you couldn't get on. Also, while you were waiting for the bus, there were two benches. One said blacks and one said whites. And that was when I first started asking questions.
How did your family respond to living under white rule in South Africa?
Well, my parents and ultimately myself, we were opposed to apartheid. We thought that it was morally wrong. We also believed that it really couldn't sustain itself in the modern world. And we belonged to one of the political parties that was called the Progressive Party, which was, dominated by white liberal people, usually English speaking, and that is the party to which we subscribed as a somewhat democratic way of trying to have things change over. But the National Party, which invented the apartheid, had been in rule since 1948, and they ruled all the way up till 1994. So the Progressive Party was a tiny representation of the white population.
Did you know about Mandela?
I found out about Mandela because when I was a small child of 9 or 10 and started asking questions, I remember asking my mother, "This is all so wrong and so evil. How come the black people didn't stand up and say something, or stand up and fight, or refuse to obey these rules?" And that's when my mother told me about Mandela and how they had stood up and they had protested, but they were just simply swept up into jail and locked up without trial.
Did you witness any resistance events or know anyone part of the resistance movement?
Well, I did. I mean, in 1976, I was in high school. I was 16 years old, and that was the year that the Soweto riots were happening. And so, there was a lot of turmoil. We were scared. Um, our domestic servants, I remember, came to warn us that there was going to be a kill the white day and that we should stay home and not go to school. And I remember that our parents took turns in guarding the school because we were afraid that it was going to be attacked or, um, you know, somehow rioted against, because I did attend a government school. And so, as a government institution, it was vulnerable to attack. Later on in college, I had many, many acquaintances who were detained. And detention is something that happened in apartheid era where you could literally be arrested and put into jail without trial or out notification. And I knew many people who that happened to.
Is there anything else you'd like to share?
I would just like to say that my family's prediction was true, that apartheid could never sustain itself in the modern day world. And it was a miracle that in 1994, the National Party had also come to the realization that they were better off to negotiate an agreement and a settlement with Mandela's party while he could. So the uh, the president at the time, de Klerk, entered into negotiations with the ANC, and they came up with an agreement where the government did transition to majority vote, and in 1994, South Africa became a place for one man, one vote.
Okay, thank you for your time, Mrs. Young, and I hope you've had a good time in America.